Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. What does President Biden mean for the United States, for the world, and in particular, what does it mean for India? Those are three key issues I shall raise today with the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington and one of the great experts on Indo-US relations, Ashley Tellis. Dr. Tellis, most American newspapers and news channels have declared Joe Biden the winner of the election. But the truth is, several states still have scheduled recounts, and President Trump has challenged in several courts the outcome, or in fact, the counting. So at the end of this process, do you believe Joe Biden will be confirmed as president, or could Donald Trump retain his job?
I think there is absolutely no doubt that however the process works itself out, Joe Biden will be declared the president-elect of the United States. I think what the Republican Party is doing now is fighting a rearguard action, but it will not fundamentally change the outcome. Even if it went to the courts, I'm skeptical that the courts would do anything to change what the electoral tallies are showing, which is that Biden has won the popular vote by a convincing majority and the electoral college as well. So for all practical purposes, I think we have to look at Joe Biden as the next president of the United States.
In that case, let's proceed on that assumption.
Sure.
The first problem Joe Biden will face is that he inherits a very badly, deeply divided country. 70 million plus people have voted for Trump, and many, if not most of them, believe the election has been stolen from him. Secondly, the Democrats have failed to win the Senate, and their majority in the House of Representatives has been reduced. So when it comes to governance, how easy or difficult is it going to be for President Biden?
I think it's going to be it is going to be an uphill task. There's no question about it, because even if Trump departs the scene, and there's no clarity about whether he will, in fact, depart the scene like previous presidents did, which is, just fade into the background. But even if he does that, the forces of Trumpism are still alive. There is still an anxious minority of people who are worried about the direction of the country, who don't like the way the United States has evolved in the last several decades, who will continue to exemplify Trump's grievances. And I think Joe Biden, beyond all the usual challenges of governance, will have to do much to bridge this huge chasm that currently exists in the United States. And it's a chasm that really exists in multiple dimensions. It's not just differences in politics. There are differences in attitudes to what constitutes acceptable norms about American democracy, how leaders ought to conduct themselves, what the role of government is in the lives of citizens, and what the role of the United States is in the world. So there are fundamental divides on each of these issues that Joe Biden will have to address. So much of his task is really going to be about healing the United States first and foremost before he does anything else.
The advantage he has, of course, is that he's been a senator for 36 years. He has personal relations on the other side of the aisle, starting with, of course, the Senate Majority Leader, who's a very strong supporter at the moment of President Trump. Do you believe that this is one particular part of his talent that he will desperately need to rely on? His capacity to reach out, his capacity to be emollient, his capacity to win people over?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first, there is a fundamental decency about Joe Biden, which, even his critics will very easily concede. As a person, he's not a polarizing personality, and he has spent, many years in the Senate working across the aisles. I remember when we were approaching him during those very difficult days of getting the US civil nuclear agreement moved on the Hill. And he represented the Democratic Party, and they were skeptical of this initiative that George W. Bush had undertaken. But Biden saw the strategic value in it, and he worked with his own party to bring them around. He worked with, the Republican leadership at the time, Dick Lugar in particular, and we got it across the finish line. And to my mind, that is really, it exemplifies his style of operating. So he brings to the job enormous assets, enormous assets. And I think, as you pointed out, his relationship with Mitch McConnell and with the other Republican leaders, I think will really pay rich dividends. He's not the guy who will shy away from reaching across the aisle to get things done.
Let's focus a little on some of the key challenges he faces. In the speech that he made last night, he's already identified coronavirus as the single biggest challenge he faces. And the truth is that, in fact, in America at the moment, cases are growing by an astonishing 120,000 a day. Now, he's appointed a task force, but there are still 70 days to go before he takes over. So in this interim stage, where at the moment he doesn't even have any assistance from the Federation, how meaningful a step is this?
No, I think it's a very important step in setting a tone and in showing purposefulness with respect to addressing what is a national crisis. But obviously it has no executive effect, in the sense that until he is actually sworn in, he does not make policy and cannot make policy. But I think he's signaling a couple of things. First, that he takes the management of the pandemic very seriously. Unlike Trump, who was contradictory and vacillating by turns, Joe Biden is basically saying, this is a national emergency, we've got to treat it as a national emergency. And I think that is an important message to be sent out. The second thing that he's signaling is that, we are going to deal with this by the best canons of scientific understanding. Even though our knowledge of the virus is still imperfect, it's better than it was, many months ago. And what he's trying to communicate is that scientific credibility, listening to expertise is going to be important for his administration, and it is going to guide the shaping of public policies in this issue. And given the terrible divide in the United States about simple things like wearing a mask, I think this is a very good step forward. Now, as you yourself alluded to, it's not going to be easy because there are attitudes that have hardened as a result of the last 4 years. But, this is the best card he has to play. And I think he has really begun on a very, very, very good note.
The other big challenge that President Biden will face is, of course, the economy. But here the paradox is that actually under President Trump, the economy was doing really rather well until the pandemic hit America in March. In fact, many people consider handling the economy one of the successes of Donald Trump. What do you think will be Biden's approach?
Well, clearly, Trump benefited from the fact that the economy was already on an upward swing when he came into office. Remember, he is the beneficiary of the comeback that the United States made after the 2008 financial crisis. And he certainly propelled it to even greater heights with the major tax cuts that he enacted. And so I have no difficulty crediting him with sustaining the economic upswing as he did. And if the pandemic had not intervened, I think there was actually a reasonable chance that he might have even been reelected. Today, the economy has taken a very brutal hit because of the pandemic. But I think Joe Biden has got his priorities right. You can't sustain an economic comeback if you don't deal with the pandemic directly. That is, there is no macroeconomic solution that is available to the US government which allows the economy to make a comeback if the pandemic is still raging. And so, in effect, his solution to dealing with the economic crisis is to attack the pandemic more resolutely. And I think that is a smart thing to do because it is the only thing to do. We will not be able to sustain, an economic comeback if the pandemic still continues to take a toll on consumption, on employment, and the simple ways of interacting in ordinary life.
Now, the other deep rift in America is race. And periodically, in fact, I should say perhaps frequently, it explodes in violence on the streets of your cities. Will the fact that America now has its first African American, Indian American vice president make a telling difference?
I hope it does. I hope it does. But remember, we had an African American president not too long ago, and a very successful presidency. And it ended up just contributing to further polarization in our country. And so I would look beyond the personalities. And of course, Kamala Harris is, like President Obama before her, an epoch-making, personality. I mean, she is the first African-American woman to be elected, vice president-elect. So, but we have to look beyond the personalities. We have to look at the structural cleavages that exist in the United States. And those cleavages will not be remedied simply because we have, a new African-American personality at the helm of political life. So there is much more that we have to do, and I think both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are very attuned, to the fact that reconciliation is going to be an ongoing endeavor. It's going to be a long process, and requires changing the attitudes and mindsets of a large minority of Americans who feel very uncomfortable with, the growing multiculturalism in American society and the changing face of American life.
In fact, this is going to be perhaps in a sense the most intractable problem President Biden will face, because this is not just a question of applying a healing touch, which he has the right personality to do. Here the challenge is changing the way people think, changing their prejudices, as you said, changing their mindsets. That is neither easy, nor can it be done quickly. It's a problem that has to be tackled for years.
That is absolutely right. I mean, this is not just a matter of a Biden presidency. This is really a generational transformation. Remember, we are now seeing in some ways the effects of what happened through the civil rights movement and the legislation that was passed in the 60s, which opened the United States to Asian immigration. Both the civil rights movement and the opening of the United States to Asian immigration has created an opportunity for a better America and for a more diverse America. And there are portions of American society that feel very uncomfortable with that diversity because pre-existing privileges are being challenged in different ways. Can Biden fix it himself? Absolutely not. Will it be resolved in a matter of 4 years? Absolutely not. But this is a transition that America has to go through because the demographics demand it. I mean, there will come a point in the not too distant future when white Americans will simply be a plurality of Americans. They will not have the demographic majorities that they enjoyed, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so America itself is evolving. And it is not surprising to me that there are resentments that new immigrants have been more successful than some Americans have been. But this is part of what the making of a nation is. America is constantly remaking itself. And this is part of that remaking. And people will have to get used to it because there is no way to turn the clock back. There is no way to turn the clock back. And so the question is, can it be done in a way that inspires even those who seem to be at the losing end of the spectrum? Can they be convinced that this is part of America's evolution and that it is a desirable evolution? And I think that is really the task that Biden faces in this area.
Now, Dr. Tellis, before I talk to you about what a President Biden means for India, which is, I know, a subject my audience is particularly keen to hear you on, let me briefly touch on what a President Biden means internationally. Do you believe or do you expect him to reverse Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Accord, from the World Health Organization, from the Iran nuclear deal? Or do you think those are steps that may be just one or two stages too far for him to go?
No, I think his intention is clearly to get America back into international engagement in a very vigorous and sustained way. Now, one has to look at the particulars in each of the cases that you identified. I think getting back into the Paris Accords is inevitable. I don't see any major disagreement within the democratic leadership on that issue. I suspect the same would be true of the World Health Organization. With Iran, I just have a question mark. I think there is a desire to put the JCPOA, in a sense, back into operation. But whether they can simply turn back the clock and go back to the old agreement, is something that will have to be closely looked at, because both the international community and Iran have moved some distance from what the original agreement required. But the intention that the United States should get back into the international system, should uphold the international order that it built since 1945, should accept global responsibilities and the disproportionate burdens of sustaining that system. These are all views that Joe Biden, sort of congenitally believes. And so I expect that you will see a return to a more traditional American role, with one big asterisk. And the asterisk is that we need to get our affairs, in order at home, in order to be able to play that expansive role that Biden would like. And so as long as we can, keep our affairs at home in good, tidiness, I expect that we will be back on the international stage in a way that most people are familiar with.
Very quickly on the Iran nuclear deal, I take your point that rolling it back, going back to what the original status quo was, will be difficult. But do you expect that he will unwind the sanction regime against Iran that Donald Trump imposed?
Well, my suspicion is that that will be part of a negotiation. In fact, I think he would be unwise to unwind the sanctions regime unilaterally, because there are commitments that Iran would have to make, or at least have to reinstate. So it will be part of a negotiation, and our European partners, I think, are open to re-entering that negotiation. But apart from the detail, I mean, the key point is this. Biden is someone who believes that the United States should stand by its international commitments. And he will go back as best he can to undoing the damage that Trump has done in the last 4 years, in the way that he has treated both the international community, multilateral organizations, and then the global order more generally.
Now, the one relationship under Trump that was steadily moving towards confrontation is the relationship with China. Do you see significant changes on that front, or will they really only be changes in terms of tone and style?
Well, I think it will be more than issues of style. I think the competition between the United States and China now is a structural competition. It's really a clash of fundamental interests. And therefore, even Joe Biden cannot simply turn back the clock. So I think US-China competition is here to stay, but the style and the manner in which that competition is prosecuted at the US end, I think, will change. My suspicion is that it will not be all-out, zero-sum competition in the way that Trump framed it. I think that competition will be much more nuanced. It will be much more focused. And there will be elements of both cooperation and competition existing simultaneously. And that, of course, has the risk that it will blur the character of the competition. And that will create, complications for our Asian allies, and it'll create complications even for us. But I suspect there will be a refinement in the way the US approaches China, rather than, the sort of zero-sum approach that Trump adopted in the last 4 years.
One more question on the impact President Biden will have internationally. And I'm going to ask you about British-American relations, because oddly enough, as you know, it's a subject that is closely followed in India as well. Trump had led the British to believe that a post-Brexit free trade agreement with America could be easily established. Do you believe Joe Biden will be much more concerned about the impact of Brexit on the Good Friday Agreement, thus making it more difficult or at least not easy, for Boris Johnson to realize his hopes of a free trade agreement with the United States?
Well, I think the impact of Brexit on Good Friday is a serious issue because that was an enormous success, and no one in the United States wants to see a return to the terrible disasters that we saw in Northern Ireland for decades. But I would be very skeptical that a UK-US free trade agreement can be negotiated easily. And that has to do, again, with the character of free trade negotiations. Free trade negotiations prove to be very protracted and very difficult in the detail. And no matter what Trump was advertising on that score, even if Biden wants a free trade agreement, it's not something that we will be able to conclude very quickly. And let's be honest here. I mean, the mood in the country at the moment is not exactly favorable towards free trade agreements. I say that with some regret because, I think free trade has been good for the United States. But in the scheme of priorities that Biden has, negotiating a free trade agreement with Great Britain, I don't think, figures very high on the list.
Let's at this point come to the subject that I think everyone wants to hear you speak about, what a President Biden will mean for India. Now, as you know, perhaps better than me, there was a fairly strong personal relationship that had been developed between Narendra Modi and Donald Trump. Many people believe that Howdy Modi last year and Namaste Trump this February were in fact virtual endorsements for the outgoing American president. Might that rankle with Joe Biden?
I don't think so. I mean, people recognize the requirements of realpolitik. And I don't, I can't speak for the prime minister, but I don't believe the prime minister, had some innate affection for President Biden either. I mean, he did what raison d'etat required. He saw Biden as the president of the United States, a very powerful individual. Modi has bet strongly on a new relationship with the United States. He also recognized Trump's mercurial character. And what he persisted with was essentially a disarmament strategy. And he did that with India's best interests in mind. And, if it took a few bear hugs and if it took a few, raucous rallies to convey to Trump that India was in fact a good partner and was deserving of the considerations that Trump's predecessors had offered India, then so be it. I think people in the United States and certainly the Democratic leadership is sophisticated enough to know that India did what necessity required at that time. And no one's going to hold it against the prime minister because he had a good relationship with Trump. I think the challenges are going to be more fundamental and go beyond personality. But Modi's personal relationship with Trump, whatever it was, I don't think is going to be a significant or a lasting stumbling block.
Let's come to some of those challenges. There is a body of opinion in India that is apprehensive that a Democratic White House will put much more pressure on India on issues like the Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Register of Citizens, the attitude to NGOs, Jammu and Kashmir, treatment of Muslims, and press freedom. Do you believe that the Democrats, particularly Joe Biden, will put pressure on these issues?
Well, let me step back for a moment before I address that question specifically. I think there has been a rising tide of concern in the United States among both Republicans and Democrats about some of the developments that have occurred in India in recent months. We should not forget that this is not just a Democratic preoccupation. Republicans have been equally concerned about some of these developments. But equally, there is an understanding that these are domestic developments which are taking place within the framework of a democratic polity in India. And so people will approach these issues, I think, with due caution, which is they want to be respectful of India's own choices. And they want to leave Indian democracy, to do its thing. If correction is required, to allow democracy to do the correction that democracy brings. And so even if you have a Joe Biden in the White House, I don't think our relations with India are going to be defined by our anxieties about India's domestic politics. This doesn't mean the anxieties disappear. This doesn't mean that there is an absence of concern. But how those anxieties and concerns are expressed, I think will remain in line with what previous American governments have done. And in many ways, I think Barack Obama set the standard for how to deal with this. When he visited India during his last visit, he had a very transparent and honest conversation with the Prime Minister. When he went public, he held up common ideals which challenged both the United States and India. And I thought it was, a very good balance where he conveyed what our, concerns were in private without making them totemic in any way, while also challenging both of us, right? Because it's not just Indian problems. We have enough problems of our own. So he challenged both Indian and American societies to live up to the ideals of democracy. And I suspect that, at least the executive branch of the US government in a Biden administration will follow pretty much the same model.
You mentioned that visit of President Obama. It was, I think, 2015 when he came as chief guest at Republic Day. And in that last town hall, he reminded India of its own constitutional commitment to respect for all religions, clearly hinting that India was not living up to what it was committed to do. I also recall that the last time our present foreign minister visited America, he cancelled a meeting with the House of Representatives Foreign Relations Committee because Pramila Jayapal, who was a critic of some of India's policies vis-a-vis Kashmir, vis-a-vis Muslims, was going to be present. And if I recall correctly, at that time, Kamala Harris actually was critical of our foreign minister. Do you think that, unlike the Republicans, who took this and didn't make an issue of it, the Democrats will be more outspoken and less understanding?
Well, there are two elements to the issues going forward as I see them. First, depending on what happens in India, there will be more constituencies in the future than have been in the past. Constituencies that voice their concerns about India's democracy and India's treatment of minorities and so on and so forth. I just see the political space in the United States as having opened up sufficiently for both government and non-governmental bodies to be more vociferous, in their complaints about what they think is going on in India. So that's one. I think you will see a variety of voices on the subject. But that has always been true in some sense, right? The United States is always a cacophony. There are many interest groups. There are many bodies who feel free to express opinions in anything. What I find more worrisome is that there is a risk that concerns about Indian domestic politics will become a new political football in American politics, where if Democrats become more vociferous and critical of India, Republicans might feel inclined to defend India, not because they necessarily want to defend India on the merits, but because it is politically convenient to do so. And before you know it, one important thing will have changed, which is the bipartisan consensus about India's importance to the United States will gradually erode, and India will become one more point of controversy in US domestic politics. And if that evolution occurs, I think it would be truly unfortunate, because it will make the ability of the President of the United States, whoever he is in years to come, or she is in years to come, much more difficult, because it will become a new source of domestic controversy that I think we can do without.
Very quickly, is this an imminent prospect that you're worried about, or is it something that looms on the horizon but you're not sure will happen?
No, I think it is an imminent prospect, because already you begin to see domestic constituencies both in India and the United States taking sides on this matter. I found it very interesting that Donald Trump has a substantial constituency in India. Now, it didn't matter because the government of India took position smartly that the relations that India enjoys with the United States are relations with countries and not a relation with a particular person or a particular party. And I think that is a smart way to do business. But in the United States, you will begin to see, civil society fracturing along different lines. And that could be reflected in the positions that political parties take, again, for partisan reasons. So I don't think this is a hypothetical possibility or something that is just over the horizon. I think this threat could become more real more quickly than we'd like.
Let me raise another aspect of India-US relations. Under Trump, India was a key factor in America's developing geopolitical contention with China. As a result, Trump put a lot of importance on the Indo-Pacific and on the Quad. Do you see that continuing under President Biden, or might that diminish?
So this is an area where his policy is unclear on the details. As I said earlier, I think the competition with China will continue. I hope that the Indo-Pacific construct survives in a Biden administration. And I say that because it is in America's strategic interest that it does. I think we have to think of the Indo-Pacific space increasingly as a convergent, if not a unified space, for our own reasons. And so I hope that survives. Whether the Biden administration puts as much, political capital on the Quad, I think remains to be seen. What I think is far more important is that the US rebuild its alliance relationships in Asia. That's really our first line of defense. The Quad is important as a consultative mechanism, and we ought to protect it for that purpose. But I don't think we ought to invest the Quad with mystic qualities. It is not an institution that is capable of performing collective defense functions. It's not an institution that allows us to do vigorous pushback of China except diplomatically. Only our alliances can do that. And so if I were in a Biden administration, the first order of business I would focus on is to make certain that our ties with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, with Taiwan, with the Philippines, and even with Ireland, actually are put back in order before we do anything else. India is extremely important in this context, but our relations with India are very different from the relationships we have with our allies. And I think it would be unfortunate if we sacrificed our allied relationships in order to invest in an institution like the Quad, which to my mind is still in its political infancy.
Now, one area where under Trump there was a problem is visas. Not just H-1B, but also visas for their spouses who wanted to work. I noticed that there is a Biden policy document that clearly suggests that perhaps as many as 500,000 Indians who've been waiting for citizenship could get it. Do you believe that will actually happen? And secondly, will the same leniency be shown by Biden to the H-1B problem?
Well, Trump's immigration policies were, simply put, quite insane because they were fundamentally counterproductive to American interests. I think he did not understand how important interdependence was for American prosperity, for American competitiveness, for American innovation. He didn't understand this. He just could not understand this. And so the campaign that he conducted, with the aid of people like Stephen Miller and stuff, I think was just deeply counterproductive. Now, Biden will change those elements of immigration policy that can be changed by executive action. I have no doubt about that. So to the degree that changes in regulation, in enforcement strategies, and so on can be done, I expect Biden will do it. But larger changes in immigration policy which require the consent of Congress, will prove to be more difficult for the reasons that you alluded to in the beginning. Because we will have to create a package, if you want immigration reform, that satisfies very disparate constituencies in the US Congress. And, that will take a lot of work and a lot of effort. And I don't know whether Biden will have, the political capital to spend on that issue early in his presidency. If you were to sort of rank order his priorities, as he himself puts it, it's first managing the pandemic, then looking at getting Americans back to work and the economy back on the path of prosperity. And then everything else just takes a number and sort of stands in a queue. So he will address immigration because corporate America is very concerned about what the constraints on H-1B visas and the like mean for American competitiveness. But that will not be the first thing on his plate that he has to deal with.
Now, Dr. Ashley, we're coming to the end of this interview, but I can't possibly end without asking you about the sort of relationship Joe Biden will have with Pakistan. As you know, that is an issue that is keenly followed in India and usually ends up affecting India's relationship with Washington. So what sort of relationship do you think a Biden White House will follow with Islamabad? And how conscious will Biden be, who after all was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, of the fact that his relationship with Pakistan could seriously impact whatever relationship he wants with Delhi?
I think on this note, Karan, there is a sea change in US attitudes towards Pakistan. The early illusions that we had of being able to change Pakistan's course by keeping a good relationship with Washington alive, I think those illusions have slowly died. So I hope we can rebuild a productive working relationship with Pakistan. I really hope so, because it's unfortunate if we end up being on the opposite sides all the time on all the issues. But I don't think even a desire for a better relationship with Pakistan will happen through the sacrifice of America's concerns about Pakistani behaviors about terrorism. Terrorism both in the western direction against Afghanistan and terrorism in the eastern direction against India. So to the degree that Biden may want to rebuild relations with Pakistan, it's not entirely clear whether he will. But he will have to face up to the fact that the problems of terrorism are really deep-rooted in the Pakistani state's activities. And that, to my mind, will act as a huge constraint on whatever he may want to do in this area. And this is not just Biden. Like this, I think, is across the political spectrum. There is a conviction that Pakistan has been quite duplicitous, has played both ends against the middle. And that's certainly not a policy that the United States ought to support, or worse, subsidize.
Finally, Dr. Tellis, let's come to Afghanistan. President Trump has set in motion a plan for the withdrawal of American troops. Do you believe Joe Biden will stick to that schedule, or will he A, slow it down, and B, perhaps adopt a more tough, a less conciliatory attitude to Taliban?
To be honest, I don't know the answers to any of those questions. What I do know is that Joe Biden always believed that an overinvestment of U.S. resources in Afghanistan was not worth the payoff. And during the Obama years, he advocated very vigorously for a drawdown of U.S. troops and for a reduction in U.S. commitments. I do not believe he has changed his fundamental view on those issues. And so I expect that he will continue the process of drawing down US forces as long as we can protect our counterterrorism equities. So the counterterrorism equities will still remain a brake on, radical drawdowns. But what that means in the detail, I have no idea. And his administration, his campaign has not indicated, what decisions he will make. I guess we have to wait until he comes into the White House, can study the situation for himself, and then make the adjustments that may be necessary.
My last question. Joe Biden is 78. He's been the oldest president America has ever had. He has a young, vigorous vice president who's in her mid or late 50s. How important a role, how central a role will Kamala Harris play? And when you answer that, because of her Indian ancestry, will she also be involved in determining the new administration's relationship with India?
Well, on the first question, I think Biden will treat Kamala Harris the way President Obama treated Vice President Biden, which is he will make her a full partner in his administration. And I think that is a sensible thing to do, not just because of his age, but that's because the way the American system functions, and it functions best when you have president and vice president in close collaboration on all the major decisions of the administration. And that has certainly been Joe Biden's experience under President Obama. So I expect there will be some facsimile of that same pattern that we will see in the future. On the issues relating to India, I think I understand, the joy and the exultation that an American of Indian origin has now reached the vice presidency. But I don't think that will have an impact one way or the other on our relations with India. She is not going to become either a closet advocate for India in the White House or, a closet critic. Our relationship with India will be defined fundamentally by our interests, and our interests really push us in the direction of closer convergence, and by the commonality of our values. And there, what happens within India and what happens within the United States will both play a role. So I think Kamala Harris's particular contribution there will be less significant than people sometimes think.
Dr. Tellis, thank you very much for this interview. I'm particularly grateful that you've taken time to speak to us so fully about what a future President Biden could mean. Take care, stay safe.
Always a pleasure, Karan. Take care of yourself too, and all the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Pleasure.